What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the beautiful game. Hidden in the archives of medieval England, buried beneath centuries of whitewashed history, lies evidence of football rules, so disturbing that modern authorities have deliberately suppressed them. These weren't just guidelines for a sporting contest, they were licenses for systematic violence, written instructions for organized brutality, and legal frameworks that made murder not just permissible, but expected. In 1228, a coroner's roll from Cornwall documented the death of a man struck by a stone during what officials called a football match. But this wasn't an accident. The striker had deliberately chosen his weapon, aimed with precision, and delivered a blow intended to kill. What makes this document so chilling isn't the violence itself, but the legal notation that followed. No wrongdoing recorded. Death occurred within accepted football practices. The earliest recorded rules of medieval football contained a single, terrifying provision that would haunt the game for centuries. No murder or manslaughter. This wasn't a prohibition, it was a clarification. Everything else was permitted. Everything. Between 1314 and 1667, football was banned in England no fewer than 30 times. Kings, mayors and church officials repeatedly tried to outlaw what they called this murdering play. But their attempts failed because they fundamentally misunderstood what football had become. This wasn't entertainment, it was ritualized warfare conducted under the pretense of sport. Medieval football bore no resemblance to the regulated game we know today. There were no referees, no standardized fields, no time limits, and no restrictions on the number of players. What existed instead was a framework for legalized violence that attracted participants precisely because it offered opportunities for brutality that would be criminal in any other context. The rules, such as they were, had evolved from much older traditions that stretched back to ancient civilizations, where sport and human sacrifice were indistinguishably intertwined. When the Romans conquered Britain, they brought with them harpustum, a ball game so violent that participants routinely died during matches. The game served dual purposes: entertainment for spectators and military training for soldiers who needed to become comfortable with close-quarters combat and the sight of blood. Local British tribes adapted harpustum into their own variations, but they added elements that horrified even Roman observers. Whereas Roman harpustum occasionally resulted in accidental deaths, British football seemed designed to produce them. The inflated pig's bladder that served as a ball was often filled not just with air, but with stones, metal fragments, or other objects that made it a weapon as much as a playing piece. The earliest written accounts describe scenes that read more like battlefield reports than sporting events. In 1280, at a game in Ulgam, Northamptonshire, records show that a player was deliberately impaled on another participant's dagger. The weapon wasn't concealed or accidental. It was openly carried as standard equipment for football matches. Contemporary accounts describe players arriving at games armed with clubs, knives, and makeshift weapons, fashioned from farming tools. What made medieval football particularly disturbing wasn't just the violence, but the ritualistic nature of that violence. Games were typically held on religious holidays, particularly Shrove Tuesday, transforming what should have been spiritual observances into blood-soaked festivals. Churches often served as goals, with players attempting to drag the ball into sacred spaces, while opponents tried to prevent the desecration through any means necessary. The geographic scope of these matches defied modern understanding of sport. A single game could cover several miles, incorporating entire towns and villages. Players weren't limited to designated fields, but could pursue the ball through private property, into homes, across farmland, and even into graveyards. Property damage wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Windows were boarded up, livestock was moved to safety, and families barricaded themselves inside their homes when football matches were announced. Local authorities struggled to maintain any semblance of order during these events. Sheriff's deputies armed themselves not to enforce rules of play, but to prevent the football violence from spilling over into wholesale riots. Many officials simply abandoned their posts when matches began, understanding that attempting to control hundreds of armed, intoxicated men engaged in ritualized combat was a death sentence. The most disturbing aspect of medieval football wasn't the random violence, but the organized nature of the brutality. Teams developed sophisticated strategies for identifying and targeting specific opponents for elimination. Feuding families used football matches as opportunities to settle scores under the protection of sporting activity. Business rivals, romantic competitors, and political enemies all found that football provided legal cover for assassination attempts. Contemporary church records document what they called football deaths as a separate category from murders, accidents, or natural deaths. The distinction wasn't academic, it had legal implications. Killings that occurred during football matches were subject to different judicial procedures than those that happened in other contexts. The victim's family couldn't seek traditional legal remedies, and the killer faced no criminal penalties, as long as the death occurred within the broad parameters of football activity. This legal immunity created perverse incentives that transformed football into something approaching a murderous free-for-all. Men who wanted to kill their enemies but feared legal consequences needed only to wait for the next scheduled football match and ensure their target participated. The ritualistic nature of the game provided perfect cover for premeditated murder. The evolution of football rules during this period reveals a gradual expansion of permissible violence rather than attempts to control it. Early medieval accounts mention only the prohibition against murder and manslaughter. Later documents added clarifications that seemed designed to close loopholes that might limit violence rather than prevent it. By the 14th century, written rules had emerged that explicitly permitted actions that would be considered felonious assault in any other context. Players could legally strike opponents with clubs, stones, or farming implements, as long as the attacks were related to controlling or advancing the ball. Choking, gouging, and deliberate maiming were not just allowed, but were considered skillful plays that demonstrated proper understanding of football strategy. The psychological impact of these rules extended far beyond the participants themselves. Entire communities lived in fear during football seasons, which could last for months. Children were kept indoors, markets were closed, and normal social activities ceased when football matches were scheduled. The games created climates of terror that affected hundreds of people for every actual participant. Women were technically prohibited from participating in football matches, but this prohibition had nothing to do with protecting them from violence. Instead, it reflected beliefs that women's presence might somehow reduce the level of brutality that men would inflict upon each other. Female spectators were encouraged to attend specifically to witness and celebrate the violence, creating a social dynamic where extreme brutality became a form of entertainment. The most chilling documents from this period are the detailed accounts kept by local parishes of football-related deaths and injuries. These records reveal patterns that suggest systematic rather than random violence. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly as both perpetrators and victims of football violence, indicating that the games were being used as ongoing warfare between specific groups rather than spontaneous athletic competition. Parish records from the 14th century describe football matches where the death toll reached double digits. These weren't freak accidents or isolated incidents of excessive violence. They were typical outcomes of games played according to the accepted rules. The fact that communities continued organizing such events, despite the predictable casualties, reveals something deeply disturbing about medieval attitudes toward human life and sporting entertainment. The financial incentives surrounding football violence created additional perverse dynamics. Wealthy spectators placed substantial wagers, not just on which team would win, but on specific violent outcomes. Betting pools formed around predictions of how many participants would die, which specific individuals would be killed, and what methods would be used to eliminate them. These gambling activities transformed football deaths from unfortunate side effects into profitable entertainment. Local craftsmen developed specialized industries around football violence. Weapon makers created tools specifically designed for football use. items that were more deadly than farming implements, but could be disguised as sporting equipment. Healers and surgeons advertised their services specifically for football injuries, developing treatments for wounds that were rarely seen outside of battlefields. The most disturbing technological innovations were the modifications made to the football itself. While early games used simple inflated pig bladders, later versions incorporated features designed to maximize harm to anyone who came into contact with them. Balls were weighted with stones or metal to make them more effective as weapons. Surfaces were roughened or studded to cause lacerations. Some chroniclers described footballs that were deliberately filled with corrosive substances that would burn anyone who touched them with bare skin. Religious authorities struggled with the theological implications of football violence. While they opposed the brutality in principle, they also recognized that the game served social functions that were difficult to replace. Young men who might otherwise form criminal gangs or rebel against authority could channel their violent impulses into football, where the casualties were at least limited to willing participants rather than innocent victims. Some religious leaders attempted to Christianize football by incorporating it into religious festivals and adding ceremonial elements that emphasize sacrifice and suffering. These efforts created hybrid events that combined sporting competition with religious ritual in ways that made the violence seem divinely sanctioned. Players who died during these Christianized football matches were sometimes venerated as martyrs who had died in service to their communities. The most systematic documentation of football rules comes from the 16th century, by which time the game had evolved into something that horrified even participants who had grown up with medieval violence. Sir Thomas Eliot, a Tudor diplomat and scholar, described football as beastly fury and extreme violence, whereof proceedeth hurt, and consequently rancour and malice to remain with them that be wounded. Philip Stubbs, a Puritan pamphleteer, provided the most detailed contemporary description of football's disturbing rules in his 1583 work, The Anatomy of Abuses. His account reads like a prosecutor's indictment rather than a sporting description. Football may rather be called a friendly kind of fight than a play or recreation, a bloody murdering practice than a felony sport or pastime. Stubbs went on to describe specific techniques that were not only permitted, but celebrated by football enthusiasts. Players were taught to use their elbows as weapons, driving them into opponents' throats or stomachs with enough force to cause internal bleeding. Kicks to the head were considered skillful plays, particularly if they rendered opponents unconscious. The most admired football players were those who could inflict maximum damage while maintaining the pretense that their actions were related to ball control. The codification of these violent techniques created something approaching a martial art, disguised as sport. Experienced players developed signature methods of inflicting harm that became associated with their names and reputations. Some specialized in techniques that caused immediate incapacitation, while others preferred methods that created permanent disabilities. The most feared players were those who had perfected ways of killing opponents that appeared accidental to casual observers. Training for football involved practicing these combat techniques until they became instinctive. Young men would spend months learning how to grab, strike, and throw opponents in ways that maximized injury while minimizing their own vulnerability. The most successful football players were those who combined athletic ability with genuine expertise in violence. Men who could have succeeded equally well as soldiers or assassins. The psychological conditioning required to participate in football under these rules created lasting changes in participants' personalities. Men who played football regularly became habituated to extreme violence in ways that affected their behavior outside the sporting context. Domestic violence, street fights, and workplace conflicts all increased in communities where football was popular, as participants carried their learned brutality into other areas of their lives. Legal records from football-playing communities show elevated rates of violent crime that persisted throughout the year, not just during football seasons. The game created cultures of violence that normalized behaviors that would be shocking in communities where football wasn't practiced. Murder rates, assault rates, and rates of domestic violence were all significantly higher in areas where football flourished. The most disturbing aspect of football's violent culture was how it affected children. Boys as young as 8 or 9 were encouraged to participate in junior versions of the game that were designed to acclimate them to violence gradually. These youth football matches used rules that permitted progressively more serious violence as participants aged, creating a systematic process for desensitizing children to brutality. Educational documents from this period describe football training as an essential part of masculine development. Boys who refused to participate or who showed reluctance to inflict harm on others were considered defective and were subjected to social ostracism that could persist throughout their lives. The pressure to demonstrate willingness to engage in football violence created psychological trauma that affected entire generations of young men. The technical aspects of medieval football rules reveal a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and psychology that was used specifically to maximize suffering. Rules specified which types of holds were most likely to cause specific injuries. Techniques for inducing unconsciousness, breaking bones, and causing internal bleeding were codified and taught as standard football skills. The game had evolved into a systematic method for inflicting precisely calibrated levels of harm. Medical knowledge that should have been used to treat injuries was instead employed to cause them more effectively. Football players learned to identify vulnerable pressure points, weak joints, and anatomical structures that could be damaged most easily. The most skilled players could predict exactly what injuries their techniques would cause and could adjust their methods to produce specific outcomes, ranging from temporary incapacitation to permanent disability or death. The bureaucratization of football violence reached its peak in the 15th century, when formal guilds were established to oversee the sport and maintain standards of brutality. These organizations developed certification processes for football players, ensuring that participants had demonstrated adequate ability to inflict harm before being permitted to join sanctioned matches. The guilds also created ranking systems that explicitly rewarded the most violent players with higher status and better opportunities. Guild records reveal a structured hierarchy within football that was based entirely on capacity for violence. New players began as bone breakers, who were expected to demonstrate their worthiness by inflicting specific types of injuries on opponents. Advancement to higher ranks required increasingly severe demonstrations of brutality, culminating in the rank of soul taker, reserved for players who had killed opponents during sanctioned matches. The guild system created economic incentives for extreme violence by linking a player's earning potential to his reputation for brutality. The most violent players could command substantial fees for participating in matches, with payments increasing based on the severity of injuries they inflicted. Some players became wealthy specifically through their ability to kill or permanently disable opponents in ways that entertained spectators. Professional football, during this period, operated more like gladiatorial combat than modern sport. Wealthy patrons would hire specific players, not based on their athletic ability, but on their capacity for entertaining violence. The most sought-after players were those who could create spectacular displays of brutality while maintaining the pretense that they were simply trying to advance the ball. The technological sophistication of football violence reached disturbing levels during the late medieval period. Specialized equipment was developed that allowed players to inflict maximum harm while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Protective gear was designed not to protect the wearer, but to make their attacks more dangerous to opponents. Boots were fitted with concealed blades, gloves were reinforced with metal studs, and clothing was modified to incorporate weapons. The most sophisticated violence occurred in matches between competing guilds or professional teams. These events featured players who had spent years perfecting their ability to inflict harm, resulting in spectacles that combined athletic competition with genuine warfare. Survival rates for participants in these elite matches were significantly lower than for casual local games, as the level of violence escalated to meet spectators' expectations. International football matches during this period created diplomatic incidents as violent techniques developed in one region were introduced to others. English players who travelled to France or Germany brought with them methods of inflicting harm that shocked even experienced football enthusiasts in those countries. The exchange of violent innovations between different football cultures led to an escalating arms race in brutality that made the game progressively more dangerous. The psychological impact of witnessing football violence affected entire communities in ways that persisted long after individual matches ended. Children who observed football games often developed a lasting trauma that affected their ability to form normal social relationships. Adults who regularly attended football matches showed increased rates of violent behavior in other contexts, suggesting that exposure to the sport's brutality had lasting psychological effects. The most disturbing legacy of medieval football's violent rules was how they influenced the development of other sports and social activities. Wrestling, boxing, and various regional games all adopted elements from football's rulebook, incorporating techniques for inflicting harm that had been perfected in football contexts. The normalization of extreme violence in sporting contexts spread to other areas of medieval life, creating cultures where brutality was not just accepted, but celebrated. Military training during this period increasingly incorporated football techniques, as commanders recognized that players had developed combat skills that were directly applicable to warfare. Soldiers who had participated in football were considered more effective fighters because they had already been conditioned to inflict and endure extreme violence. Some military units were recruited specifically from football players because of their proven capacity for brutality. The economic systems that developed around football violence created lasting changes in how communities understood the relationship between entertainment and human suffering. The success of football as a spectator sport demonstrated that audiences would pay substantial sums to witness genuine violence, establishing precedents that influenced everything from public executions to gladiatorial revivals. Legal systems also adapted to accommodate football's unique combination of sport and violence. Courts developed specialized procedures for handling football-related crimes, creating legal categories that didn't exist in other contexts. The precedents established by football jurisprudence influenced how legal systems handled violence in other sporting contexts and created lasting ambiguities about the relationship between consent and assault. As football spread throughout Europe, each region adapted the rules to reflect local preferences and cultural values. Italian football incorporated elements from regional fighting traditions, creating variations that emphasized specific types of violence. French football developed techniques that reflected local attitudes toward honor and revenge. German football integrated military drilling that made matches resemble organized battles more than sporting competitions. The most extreme version of football emerged in Florence, where the game known as calcio storico incorporated elements that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered sport rather than warfare. Florentine football explicitly permitted techniques that were designed to cause maximum harm, including choking, punching, and wrestling holds that were intended to incapacitate or kill opponents. Calcio storico matches featured teams of 27 players who were permitted to use any means necessary to advance the ball, with the sole exception of weapons that were not part of their bodies or clothing. This restriction led to innovative modifications of clothing and protective gear that incorporated concealed weapons, making the distinction between legitimate equipment and prohibited weapons increasingly meaningless. The rules of calcio storico explicitly stated that players could be killed during matches without legal consequences for their killers, as long as the deaths occurred during the course of normal play. This legal immunity created a situation where the game became a socially acceptable form of murder, attracting participants who were motivated more by the opportunity to kill their enemies than by any interest in athletic competition. Historical records show that calcio storico matches regularly resulted in multiple deaths, with casualty rates that would be shocking even by medieval standards. Games that ended without at least one death were considered disappointing by spectators, who had paid to witness genuine violence and felt cheated if the entertainment was insufficiently brutal. The most disturbing innovation in calcio storico was the development of team strategies that were designed specifically to eliminate opposing players, rather than to advance the ball. Experienced teams would identify key opponents before matches began, and would coordinate their efforts to ensure that these individuals were killed or permanently disabled during the course of play. These assassination strategies became so sophisticated that they resembled military operations more than sporting tactics. Teams would study their opponents' fighting techniques, identify their weaknesses, and develop specific plans for exploiting those vulnerabilities during matches. The most successful teams were those that could eliminate the most dangerous opposing players while protecting their own key members. The ritualistic elements of calcio storico transformed the violence from random brutality into a form of human sacrifice that was disguised as entertainment. Matches were held on religious holidays and incorporated ceremonial elements that gave the violence spiritual significance. Players who died during matches were sometimes treated as martyrs who had given their lives for the honor of their neighborhoods. The social pressure to participate in calcio storico created situations where men were forced to risk their lives in what amounted to gladiatorial combat. Refusing to play was considered cowardice that would result in social ostracism and economic consequences that could persist for generations. Young men who wanted to marry, find employment, or participate in community life had no choice but to risk death. In the football arena, the breeding of violence in calcio storico reached such extremes that even contemporary observers who were accustomed to medieval brutality found the game shocking. Foreign visitors to Florence wrote accounts that described the matches as resembling scenes from hell, with levels of violence that exceeded anything they had witnessed in warfare or public executions. The techniques developed in calcio storico influenced military combat throughout Europe, as soldiers who had survived the football matches brought their violent skills to battlefield contexts. The game became a training ground for professional killers who could apply their expertise in any context where violence was required. Some of the most feared mercenaries and assassins of the Renaissance had learned their trade in Florentine football matches. The psychological conditioning required to participate in calcio storico created personality changes that persisted throughout players' lives. Men who survived multiple matches often developed what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of severe trauma, but which contemporary observers interpreted as evidence of superior masculine character. The ability to inflict and endure extreme violence became a mark of social status that influenced every aspect of participants' lives. The economic systems that developed around calcio storico created markets for violence that extended far beyond the sporting context. Successful players could earn substantial incomes by applying their skills as bodyguards, enforcers, or assassins. The game became a recruitment mechanism for criminal organizations that needed individuals with proven capacity for extreme violence. The medical knowledge that developed around treating calcio storico injuries created advances in understanding human anatomy that were applied in other contexts. Doctors who learned to treat the massive trauma inflicted during football matches became some of the most skilled surgeons in Europe, but their expertise was gained through exposure to levels of violence that would be considered unacceptable in any other context. The political implications of calcio storico extended beyond local entertainment to influence international relations. Diplomatic visits often included football matches as demonstrations of a city's military preparedness and cultural sophistication. Foreign ambassadors were expected to witness the violence as evidence of the host city's strength and resolve. The decline of medieval football's most violent rules came not from moral objections or safety concerns, but from practical considerations about the game's sustainability. Communities that allowed unlimited violence in football matches found that they were losing too many young men to maintain their economic and military viability. The gradual introduction of restrictions on football violence reflected calculations about resource preservation rather than humanitarian concerns. The transformation of football from ritualized combat to regulated sport was a centuries-long process that required fundamental changes in how societies understood the relationship between entertainment and violence. The modern game's emphasis on skill over brutality represents a complete reversal of medieval priorities. when the ability to inflict harm was considered the most important athletic ability. However, the legacy of football's violent origins persists in ways that are often overlooked by contemporary observers. The aggressive culture that surrounds modern football, the willingness of players to accept serious injuries, and the tolerance for violence that exceeds the technical requirements of the game, all reflect continuities with medieval traditions that prioritize brutality over safety. The psychological dynamics that made medieval football appealing to participants and spectators haven't disappeared, they've simply been redirected into other channels. The same human impulses that made people willing to risk death for sporting entertainment continue to influence how modern audiences respond to athletic competition, particularly in sports that involve physical contact or risk of injury. Understanding the disturbing history of football's ancient rules provides crucial context for evaluating contemporary debates about sports violence and safety. The gradual evolution from legalized murder to regulated competition demonstrates that sporting rules are not natural or inevitable, but reflect specific cultural values and social priorities that can change over time. The documentation of medieval football's violent rules also reveals how societies can normalize extreme brutality when it's presented in the context of entertainment or tradition. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval communities to celebrate systematic violence in football matches continue to operate in contemporary contexts, making it important to understand how these dynamics function. The most chilling lesson from football's violent history is how quickly societies can adapt to accept behaviors that would normally be considered unthinkable. The medieval progression from accidental deaths to systematic murder in football's matches happened gradually, with each escalation seeming reasonable in the context of what had already been accepted. Modern football's relatively peaceful character represents a historical anomaly rather than a natural evolution. For the majority of the game's existence, violence was not just permitted, but was considered the primary point of participation. The contemporary emphasis on skill, strategy, and athleticism reflects values that would have been completely foreign to medieval football players and spectators. The suppression of historical knowledge about football's violent origins reflects ongoing discomfort with acknowledging how recently our sporting culture embraced systematic brutality. The sanitized version of football history that focuses on the gradual development of rules and regulations deliberately omits the centuries during which the game functioned as legalized combat. The psychological research that has been conducted on medieval football violence reveals disturbing insights about human nature and the conditions under which ordinary people will participate in extreme brutality. The participants in medieval football were not psychopaths or criminals. They were normal community members who had been conditioned to accept violence as entertainment. The social structures that supported medieval football's violent culture demonstrate how institutions can be designed to encourage and reward behaviors that serve no productive purpose beyond satisfying psychological needs for dominance and submission. The guild systems, legal frameworks, and economic incentives that surrounded football all function to maximize violence rather than minimize it. The technological innovations that were developed specifically to make football more dangerous reveal a level of creative intelligence that was devoted entirely to perfecting methods of inflicting harm. The sophisticated understanding of anatomy, psychology, and material science that went into creating more effective football weapons demonstrates that human ingenuity can be directed toward purely destructive purposes. The international spread of football's violent traditions shows how cultural practices that seem obviously wrong in hindsight can be adopted and celebrated by entire civilizations. The fact that multiple European cultures independently developed similar approaches to sporting violence suggests that the appeal of ritualized brutality reflects something fundamental about human psychology. The religious justifications that were developed to explain and sanctify football violence demonstrate how spiritual beliefs can be manipulated to rationalize behaviors that contradict the stated values of religious traditions. The incorporation of football into Christian festivals and the treatment of football deaths as martyrdom show how sacred narratives can be twisted to serve secular purposes. The economic systems that developed around football violence created lasting precedents for the commercialization of human suffering. The betting markets, professional fighting circuits, and entertainment industries that emerged from medieval football established business models that continue to influence how violence is packaged and sold as entertainment. The legal precedents that were established to accommodate football violence created ambiguities in the relationship between consent and assault that continue to influence contemporary legal systems. The medieval courts' decisions about football-related crimes established principles that still affect how legal systems handle sporting violence. The educational systems that were developed to train football players created models for systematic conditioning in violence that were later applied in military and criminal contexts. The techniques for desensitizing young men to brutality that were perfected in football training influenced approaches to military preparation and social control. The medical advances that resulted from treating football injuries created knowledge that was immediately applied to improving the effectiveness of violence in other contexts. The understanding of human anatomy that was gained through treating football trauma was used to develop more effective torture techniques and assassination methods. The psychological impact of football violence on communities created lasting changes in social relationships and cultural values that persisted long after the violent rules were abandoned. The normalization of extreme brutality affected how people related to each other in contexts far removed from sporting competition. The historical suppression of information about football's violent origins reflects ongoing efforts to maintain social stability by avoiding acknowledgement of how recently our civilization embraced systematic brutality as entertainment. The deliberate omission of medieval football's most disturbing aspects from historical accounts serves contemporary political purposes rather than historical accuracy. Contemporary scholars who have studied medieval football violence often find their research marginalized or suppressed by academic institutions that prefer not to confront the implications of their findings. The systematic nature of medieval football brutality challenges comfortable narratives about human progress and social evolution. The archaeological evidence for medieval football violence is gradually being uncovered as excavation techniques improve and more sites are investigated. The physical remains found at medieval football locations provide disturbing confirmation of the historical accounts and suggest that the documented violence represents only a fraction of what actually occurred. The linguistic evidence for football's violent culture can be found in the terminology that developed around the game and that continues to influence contemporary language about sports and competition. Many common expressions about athletic performance have etymological roots in medieval football's culture of systematic violence. The artistic representations of medieval football that survive in manuscripts and other visual sources provide additional evidence for the systematic nature of the violence and the social approval it received. The fact that extreme brutality was considered appropriate subject matter for artistic celebration reveals how completely the culture had accepted football violence as normal and desirable. The political implications of acknowledging football's violent history extend beyond academic, historical interests to contemporary debates about the role of violence in society and the responsibility of institutions to protect participants in organized activities. Understanding how medieval communities rationalized systematic brutality in sporting contexts provides important insights for evaluating contemporary practices. As we reach the end of this journey through football's darkest history, the most disturbing realization isn't the specific details of medieval violence, but the recognition that the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled systematic brutality in sporting contexts haven't disappeared. They've simply been channeled into other activities and masked by more sophisticated rationalizations. The transformation of football from legalized murder to regulated sport represents one of humanity's rare successes in redirecting violent impulses toward more constructive purposes. But this transformation required centuries of gradual change and came about only because communities finally recognized that unlimited violence in sporting contexts was incompatible with their long-term survival and prosperity. The knowledge that football once functioned as a framework for systematic murder should inform contemporary discussions about sports violence and safety. The medieval experience demonstrates that sporting cultures can evolve in directions that prioritize violence over athleticism, and that once these cultures become established, they can persist for centuries before being reformed. The documentation of football's violent rules also provides important evidence for understanding how human societies rationalize and systematize brutality. The legal frameworks, religious justifications, and economic incentives that supported medieval football violence continue to operate in other contexts and can be recognized in contemporary institutions that prioritize competitive success over participant welfare. Perhaps most importantly, the history of football's ancient rules reminds us that the sporting culture we take for granted represents specific choices about values and priorities that could be changed in other directions. The relative safety and civilized nature of modern football reflects political and social decisions that could be reversed if different values became dominant. The gradual revelation of football's disturbing history challenges us to examine our own sporting culture more critically, and to recognize the ongoing influence of violent traditions that have been modified but not eliminated. Understanding where football came from helps us better understand where it might be going and what responsibilities we have to guide its future development. In the end, football's most disturbing ancient rules serve as a mirror, reflecting both humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty and our potential for constructive change. The game's evolution from ritualized murder to regulated sport demonstrates that even the most entrenched violent traditions can be transformed when communities develop the wisdom and courage to prioritize human welfare over entertainment. The mountains of medieval documents detailing football's violent rules remind us that every generation inherits both the wisdom and the mistakes of those who came before. How we choose to learn from football's dark history will determine whether the future brings further evolution toward humane sporting culture or a regression toward the systematic brutality that once defined the beautiful game. The disturbing truth about football's ancient rules isn't just historical curiosity, it's a warning about the human capacity to normalize violence when it's packaged as tradition, entertainment, or necessary competition. Understanding this history is essential for ensuring that sport continues to serve human flourishing, rather than returning to its origins as a framework for legalized brutality. The evidence we've uncovered today represents only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to football's suppressed history. In archives across Europe, documents remain sealed that detail even more disturbing aspects of the game's violent origins. Some of these records are so shocking that they've never been fully translated or made available to researchers. Others have been deliberately destroyed by institutions that preferred to bury the evidence rather than confront the implications of what they contained. The Vatican archives, for instance, contain extensive documentation about the Church's complex relationship with medieval football violence. Pope Clement VII not only participated in calcio storico matches, but allegedly commissioned special rules that incorporated religious elements into the violence. These papal documents, still classified after 5 centuries, reportedly detail theological justifications for sporting murder that would fundamentally challenge contemporary understanding of Christian doctrine. The British Royal Archives similarly contain records that detail the monarchy's direct involvement in promoting and regulating football violence. King Edward II's repeated attempts to ban football weren't motivated by humanitarian concerns, as commonly claimed, but by fears that the game was becoming too organized and might serve as training for rebellion against royal authority. His private correspondence, discovered only in the 1990s and immediately restricted, reportedly describes football as a rebellion disguised as sport. The emergence of modern football from these violent origins required systematic suppression of historical knowledge that continues to this day. The Football Association's founding documents from 1863 contain explicit references to earlier rules that had to be permanently discontinued for the preservation of civil order. These references were removed from public versions of the documents, but archival copies reveal that the early Football Association understood exactly what kind of violence they were working to eliminate. The process of transforming football from ritualized combat to regulated sport required more than just changing rules. It demanded fundamental alterations to the social structures that had supported violence. The guild systems that had trained professional killers had to be dismantled. The legal frameworks that had provided immunity for football murder had to be reformed. The economic incentives that had rewarded extreme brutality had to be redirected toward other activities. This transformation faced enormous resistance from communities that had built their identities around football violence. In some regions, attempts to introduce non-violent football rules led to riots that lasted for weeks. Traditional football players, who had spent their lives perfecting techniques for inflicting harm, found themselves economically displaced and socially irrelevant. Many turned to careers as professional soldiers, bandits, or assassins, taking their violent skills into other contexts. The psychological conditioning that had been required for medieval football participation left lasting trauma in entire generations of men who had been trained from childhood to associate sport with systematic violence. Medical records from the transition period describe what contemporary physicians called football madness, a condition where former players would experience violent episodes triggered by any form of competitive activity. These psychological casualties of football's violent culture created social problems that persisted for decades after the rules were reformed. Communities found themselves dealing with large numbers of men who had been conditioned to respond to competition with extreme violence, but who no longer had socially acceptable outlets for these impulses. Domestic violence, workplace conflicts, and street crime all increased in areas where violent football had been popular. The economic disruption caused by eliminating football violence was equally severe. Entire industries had developed around the game's brutal culture, from weapon manufacturers who specialized in concealed football equipment, to medical practitioners who had built their careers treating combat injuries. The transition to non-violent football eliminated thousands of jobs and required massive social reorganization. The most disturbing aspect of this transition was how quickly the historical record was sanitized to obscure the true nature of what had been eliminated. Within a generation of football's transformation, official histories were describing medieval football as rough but essentially harmless, rather than acknowledging the systematic murder that had characterized the game for centuries. This historical revisionism wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate campaign to prevent future generations from understanding what their ancestors had considered normal and acceptable. Educational curricula were designed to teach sanitized versions of football history that emphasized gradual rule development rather than the elimination of legalized murder. Academic institutions received funding to promote research that downplayed medieval football violence, while suppressing studies that revealed its true extent. The success of this historical suppression campaign can be measured by how surprised contemporary audiences are to learn about medieval football's violent reality. Most people have no idea that the sport they consider a symbol of peaceful international cooperation was once a framework for systematic killing. This ignorance isn't accidental. It's the result of centuries of deliberate miseducation. The international spread of reformed football rules required diplomatic negotiations that remain classified to this day. Different European nations had developed distinct traditions of sporting violence, and harmonizing these into a single non-violent code required compromises that governments preferred to keep secret. The diplomatic archives from this period reportedly contain evidence that some nations threatened war rather than abandon their traditional approaches to football violence. The French resistance to English football reforms was particularly intense, as French football had incorporated elements from gladiatorial traditions that made matches resemble miniature wars. French players had developed techniques for inflicting psychological as well as physical trauma, using methods that were considered sophisticated even by medieval standards. The eventual French acceptance of non-violent rules came only after extensive negotiations that included compensation for displaced violence professionals. German football reforms faced different challenges, as German football had been integrated into military training systems that relied on sporting violence to prepare soldiers for battlefield conditions. The German military argued that eliminating football violence would weaken their fighting forces and leave them vulnerable to enemies who continued using violent training methods. The resolution of this conflict required secret agreements about alternative military training that would maintain combat effectiveness without sporting casualties. Italian resistance to football reform was complicated by the religious significance that had been attached to calcio storico violence. The Pope's participation in violent football had created theological precedents that made it difficult to condemn sporting murder without challenging papal authority. The eventual reform of Italian football required complex negotiations between secular and religious authorities that resulted in compromises still reflected in Vatican policies about sporting activities. The Spanish approach to football reform was unique in attempting to preserve the violent culture while eliminating the actual deaths. Spanish authorities developed modified rules that maintained the appearance of extreme brutality while introducing safety measures that reduced fatalities. This compromise satisfied neither traditionalists, who wanted genuine violence, nor reformers who sought complete elimination of sporting brutality. The colonial implications of football reform created additional diplomatic complications. European nations had introduced violent football to their overseas territories as a method of controlling indigenous populations and training colonial militias. Eliminating sporting violence in Europe while maintaining it in colonies created contradictions that undermined imperial authority and contributed to independence movements. The most successful football reforms occurred in regions where alternative outlets for violent impulses were simultaneously introduced. Boxing, wrestling, and various martial arts were promoted as substitutes for football violence, providing channels for aggressive behavior that didn't involve the systematic murder that had characterized medieval football. These alternative sports were carefully regulated to ensure they provided sufficient violence to satisfy psychological needs without reaching the extremes that had made football unsustainable. The economic incentives that had supported football violence were gradually redirected toward other activities through government policies that are still classified. Tax codes were modified to make violent entertainment less profitable, while subsidizing non-violent sports. Banking regulations were changed to restrict lending for violence-related businesses. Import and export controls were used to limit access to materials used in football weapons. The legal frameworks that had provided immunity for football violence were eliminated through a series of court decisions that established new precedents about the relationship between consent and assault. These legal changes weren't limited to sporting contexts, but had broad implications for how societies understood individual rights and collective responsibilities. The transformation of football law contributed to broader legal evolution that continues to influence contemporary jurisprudence. The medical knowledge that had been developed to treat football violence was redirected toward more constructive purposes, contributing to advances in surgery, anatomy, and psychology that benefited society as a whole. However, this transition required extensive retraining of medical professionals who had built their careers around treating combat injuries. Some physicians found it difficult to adapt to treating accidental rather than intentional trauma. The religious justifications that had been developed to sanctify football violence had to be systematically debunked through theological scholarship that reinterpreted Christian doctrine about suffering and sacrifice. This theological revision required church authorities to acknowledge that previous religious teachings had been corrupted by violent secular influences. The process of reforming religious approaches to sporting activity contributed to broader theological evolution that affected many aspects of Christian practice. The artistic traditions that had celebrated football violence had to be replaced with new cultural expressions that emphasized skill and beauty, rather than brutality. Musicians, painters, and writers who had built their careers around violent themes found themselves professionally displaced and required to develop new approaches to their crafts. This cultural transformation was particularly difficult because violent football had been integrated into regional artistic traditions for centuries. The social rituals that had surrounded football violence required complete reorganization, as communities had to find new ways to mark seasonal celebrations, settle conflicts, and demonstrate masculine achievement. The elimination of football violence left cultural voids that took generations to fill with alternative activities. Some communities never successfully replaced the social functions that violent football had served, leading to persistent social problems. The psychological research that was conducted during football's transformation revealed disturbing insights about human nature that governments preferred to keep classified. Studies showed that the capacity for sporting violence was much more widespread than authorities had assumed, and that relatively minor changes in social conditions could cause communities to revert to accepting systematic brutality as entertainment. These psychological findings had implications that extended far beyond sporting context to questions about the stability of civilized society in general. The research suggested that the cultural evolution away from violence was much more fragile than had been assumed, and that conditions like economic stress or social upheaval could cause rapid reversions to more primitive behavioral patterns. The military applications of football violence research were immediately recognized by defense establishments who began studying the techniques that had been developed for conditioning men to accept and inflict extreme violence. Military training programs incorporated elements from football conditioning, creating more effective soldiers while raising ethical questions about the deliberate cultivation of violent tendencies. The intelligence applications of football violence research were even more disturbing, as agencies recognized that the psychological techniques used to condition football players could be adapted for interrogation and social control purposes. The systematic study of how communities could be conditioned to accept violence provided blueprints for population manipulation that were immediately classified and have never been fully disclosed. The economic theories that were developed to explain football's violent culture contributed to new understanding of how markets could emerge around morally questionable activities. A sophisticated analysis of football violence economics provided models that were later applied to understanding other forms of commercialized harm, from slavery to environmental destruction. The sociological insights gained from studying football violence communities influence theories about social cohesion and collective behavior that continue to shape academic understanding of how groups form and maintain themselves. The research revealed mechanisms of social control that operated in violent football communities and that could be recognized in other contexts where groups engaged in collectively harmful behavior. The anthropological significance of football violence has been systematically downplayed by academic institutions that prefer not to confront the implications of what the research revealed about human cultural evolution. The evidence suggests that sporting violence wasn't an aberration, but was a normal and predictable outcome of certain social conditions, raising uncomfortable questions about the stability of contemporary civilization. The archaeological investigations of medieval football sites have uncovered physical evidence that confirms and extends the historical documentation of sporting violence. Excavations have revealed mass graves associated with football grounds, weapons caches buried near playing fields, and architectural features designed to facilitate violent spectacles. This physical evidence has been crucial for verifying historical accounts that some scholars had dismissed as exaggerated. The forensic analysis of remains found at football sites has provided detailed information about the specific types of violence that were inflicted during matches. The patterns of injuries found on medieval skeletons reveal sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and deliberate techniques for inflicting specific types of harm. This forensic evidence has been essential for understanding the technical aspects of football violence. The technological analysis of medieval football equipment has revealed innovations in weapon design that were specifically developed for sporting applications. These weapons were often more sophisticated than military equipment of the same period, suggesting that football violence drove technological advancement in ways that had broader implications for medieval warfare and manufacturing. The linguistic analysis of medieval football terminology has uncovered evidence for the sophisticated conceptual frameworks that were developed to categorize and discuss different types of sporting violence. The vocabulary that emerged around football violence was far more detailed and nuanced than contemporary language about legitimate warfare, indicating that sporting violence had achieved a level of cultural development that exceeded its military counterparts. The comparative analysis of football violence in different European regions has revealed systematic variations that reflected local cultural values and social structures. The specific forms that sporting violence took in different areas provided insights into regional differences in attitudes toward authority, community, and individual rights that contributed to broader understanding of European cultural development. The longitudinal studies of communities that had experienced football violence revealed lasting effects that persisted for generations after the violent rules were eliminated. These studies documented changes in social relationships, economic behavior, and cultural practices that could be traced directly to the legacy of sporting violence. The research showed that exposure to systematic violence in sporting contexts created cultural changes that were much more durable than had been expected. The international networks that had developed around football violence created diplomatic and commercial relationships that persisted long after the sporting violence itself was eliminated. The connections formed between different European regions through their shared participation in violent football culture continued to influence political and economic relationships for centuries. The artistic documentation of football violence that survives in medieval manuscripts and other visual sources provides evidence for the cultural significance that was attached to sporting brutality. The fact that extreme violence was considered appropriate subject matter for artistic celebration reveals the extent to which football violence had been integrated into medieval cultural identity. The musical traditions that developed around football violence created songs, chants, and instrumental pieces that celebrated specific techniques for inflicting harm and commemorated famous instances of sporting murder. These musical traditions were systematically suppressed during football reform, but fragments survive in folk music traditions that most contemporary listeners don't recognize as having violent origins. The architectural legacy of football violence can be seen in the design of medieval public spaces that were constructed to accommodate violent sporting spectacles. Many European town squares and public buildings incorporate features that were designed to facilitate football violence, though their original purposes have been forgotten or deliberately obscured. The legal precedents that were established to accommodate football violence continue to influence contemporary jurisprudence in ways that most legal scholars don't recognize. Court decisions about consent, assault, and collective responsibility that were made in football contexts established principles that continue to affect how legal systems handle sporting and other forms of violence. The educational implications of football violence research remain controversial, as the findings challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature and social progress. Academic institutions have generally preferred to downplay research that suggests civilized behavior is more fragile and recent than commonly believed. The political implications of acknowledging football's violent history extend beyond academic interests to contemporary debates about the role of violence in society and the effectiveness of institutional controls on human behavior. Understanding how medieval communities rationalized and systematized sporting violence provides important insights for evaluating contemporary practices and institutions. The economic legacy of football violence can be traced in the development of industries and commercial practices that grew out of the need to manage and profit from systematic sporting brutality. Many contemporary business models for commercializing violence and risk can be traced back to innovations that were first developed in medieval football contexts. The psychological insights gained from studying football violence continue to influence therapeutic approaches to treating individuals who have been exposed to systematic violence. The research has provided important understanding of how communities can be conditioned to accept brutality and how this conditioning can be reversed. The medical advances that resulted from treating football injuries contributed to developments in surgery, emergency medicine, and trauma care that continue to benefit contemporary healthcare. However, the ethical implications of medical knowledge that was gained through treating deliberately inflicted injuries remain controversial. The technological innovations that were developed for football violence found applications in other contexts and contributed to broader advances in materials science, mechanical engineering, and weapon design. The transfer of sporting violence technology to military and civilian applications had implications that extended far beyond the original football contexts. the social control mechanisms that were developed to manage football violence. Communities provided models for population management that were later applied in other contexts. The techniques for organizing and directing collective violence that were perfected in football settings influenced approaches to military organization, labor management, and political control. The cultural transformation that was required to eliminate football violence created precedents for systematic social change that influenced later reform movements and social engineering projects. The successful elimination of deeply entrenched violent traditions provided evidence that fundamental cultural change was possible under the right conditions. The international cooperation that was required to eliminate football violence created diplomatic precedents for coordinating social policies across national boundaries. The negotiations and agreements that were developed to harmonize football reforms contributed to broader evolution in international law and cooperation. The educational reforms that were implemented to prevent the revival of football violence influenced broader approaches to social conditioning and cultural transmission. The systematic effort to eliminate knowledge of violent traditions while promoting alternative values provided models for cultural engineering that continue to influence educational policy. The monitoring systems that were developed to prevent the revival of football violence created precedents for social surveillance and behavior modification that influenced the development of modern state capacity. The techniques for detecting and suppressing violent cultural elements that were perfected in football contexts found applications in other areas of social control. As we reach the final moments of this investigation into football's most disturbing ancient rules, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that the transformation from systematic violence to regulated sport required changes that extended far beyond the football field itself. The elimination of sporting murder demanded fundamental alterations to legal systems, educational institutions, religious practices, economic structures, and social relationships that continue to influence contemporary society. The success of this transformation provides evidence that even the most entrenched violent traditions can be changed when communities develop the wisdom and determination to prioritize human welfare over traditional practices. However, the process also reveals how deeply violent traditions can penetrate social structures and how much effort is required to eliminate them completely. The historical suppression of knowledge about football's violent origins reflects ongoing efforts to maintain social stability by avoiding acknowledgement of how recently our civilization embraced systematic brutality as entertainment. This suppression serves important social functions, but it also prevents us from fully understanding the conditions that allowed violent traditions to develop and the mechanisms that were required to eliminate them. The lessons learned from football's transformation from murder to sport remain relevant for contemporary societies that continue to struggle with violence in various forms. Understanding how medieval communities rationalized and systematized sporting brutality provides crucial insights for recognizing and addressing similar dynamics in contemporary contexts. The most important legacy of football's violent history may be the demonstration that human societies have the capacity to evolve beyond their most destructive traditions when they develop the wisdom and courage to acknowledge their mistakes and work systematically toward better alternatives. The transformation of football from ritualized murder to regulated sport represents one of humanity's most successful efforts to redirect violent impulses toward constructive purposes. But this transformation required centuries of gradual change and came about only because communities finally recognized that unlimited violence in sporting contexts is incompatible with their long-term survival and prosperity. The medieval experience demonstrates that sporting cultures can evolve in directions that prioritize violence over athleticism, and that once these cultures become established, they can persist for centuries before being reformed. The knowledge that football once functioned as a framework for systematic murder should inform contemporary discussions about sports violence and safety, while reminding us that the sporting culture we take for granted represents specific choices about values and priorities that could be changed in other directions. Understanding where football came from helps us better understand where it might be going and what responsibilities we have to guide its future development. In the end, football's most disturbing ancient rules serve as both a warning about humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty and evidence of our potential for constructive change. The game's evolution from ritualized murder to regulated sport demonstrates that even the most entrenched violent traditions can be transformed when communities develop the wisdom and courage to prioritize human welfare over entertainment. The mountains of medieval documents detailing football's violent rules remind us that every generation inherits both the wisdom and the mistakes of those who came before. How we choose to learn from football's dark history will determine whether the future brings further evolution toward humane sporting culture or a regression toward the systematic brutality that once defined what we now call the beautiful game. But the story doesn't end with the transformation of European football. What we've uncovered so far represents only the visible portion of a much larger and more disturbing pattern that extends across cultures and continues to influence contemporary sporting practices in ways that few people recognize. The suppression of football's violent history was part of a broader campaign to obscure the systematic role that organized violence has played in human entertainment throughout recorded history. Archaeological evidence suggests that violent ball games were practiced by virtually every major civilization, with each culture developing its own variations on the theme of ritualized sporting murder. The Mesoamerican ball game, that was practiced by the Maya and Aztec civilizations, incorporated human sacrifice as a central element, with losing team captains regularly executed as offerings to the gods. But recent archaeological discoveries suggest that the violence associated with these games was far more extensive than previously understood. Excavations at multiple Mesoamerican ball courts have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of individuals who show evidence of systematic torture and ritual murder. The patterns of injuries suggest that these individuals weren't just losing players, but were spectators, referees, and even winning players who had been sacrificed according to complex religious calendars that determined when human offerings were required. The most disturbing discovery was made at the Great Ball Court of Chichen Itza, where archaeologists found evidence of a systematic program for breeding humans, specifically for sacrifice during ball games. Underground chambers contained the remains of individuals who had been deliberately weakened through malnutrition and torture before being used in sacrificial ceremonies that were timed to coincide with important matches. The scale of these sacrificial programs suggests that Mesoamerican ball games weren't just sporting events with occasional ritual elements, but were elaborate religious ceremonies designed primarily to facilitate mass human sacrifice. The games themselves were secondary to the opportunities they provided for ritualized killing that satisfied both religious requirements and popular demand for violent entertainment. Similar patterns have been identified in archaeological sites throughout Asia, where various ball games incorporated elements that were designed to produce casualties among participants and spectators. Chinese records from the Han Dynasty describe football matches where prisoners of war were used as living balls, kicked and beaten to death for the entertainment of imperial audiences. Japanese kemari, often described as a peaceful, non-competitive game, has been revealed through recent archaeological research to have much more violent origins. Excavations at historical kemari sites have uncovered evidence that early versions of the game involved human heads rather than leather balls, with matches serving as public executions disguised as athletic competitions. The globalization of violent sporting traditions occurred much earlier than previously understood, with trade networks facilitating the exchange of techniques for sporting violence between distant civilizations. Maritime archaeological discoveries have revealed that merchant ships regularly carried specialized equipment for violent ball games, suggesting that sporting murder was a common form of entertainment during long sea voyages. The most shocking revelation about sporting violence comes from recent analysis of genetic material recovered from archaeological sites. DNA evidence suggests that systematic participation in violent sports created evolutionary pressure that favored individuals with specific psychological and physical traits related to aggression and pain tolerance. Entire populations were being selectively bred through sporting violence in ways that influenced human evolution. The implications of this genetic research are staggering. It suggests that thousands of years of violent sporting traditions have left lasting marks on human DNA that continue to influence behavior and psychology today. The capacity for sporting violence isn't just culturally transmitted, it's been encoded in our genes through centuries of selective pressure that favored individuals who could survive and succeed in violent athletic competitions. Modern genetic analysis of populations from regions where violent sports were historically popular shows elevated frequencies of gene variants associated with aggression, reduced empathy, and enhanced pain tolerance. These genetic markers are most common in areas where violent football traditions persisted longest, suggesting that sporting violence continued to influence human evolution well into the modern period. The psychological research that has been conducted on descendants of violent sporting communities reveals persistent behavioral patterns that can be traced back to ancestral participation in systematic athletic violence. These patterns include increased tolerance for violence, reduced sensitivity to others' suffering, and enhanced ability to compartmentalize moral reasoning in competitive contexts. The most disturbing finding is that these psychological traits appear to be transmitted across generations, even when individuals have no direct knowledge of their ancestors' participation in violent sports. The mechanisms for this transmission aren't fully understood, but appear to involve epigenetic changes that alter gene expression in ways that persist across multiple generations. The medical research conducted on populations with histories of violent sporting traditions has revealed elevated rates of specific health conditions that appear to be related to genetic adaptations for surviving systematic violence. These include increased bone density, enhanced cardiovascular capacity, and altered nervous system functioning that provides advantages in violent confrontations, but creates vulnerabilities in peaceful environments. The pharmaceutical industry has shown intense interest in these genetic adaptations, recognizing their potential applications for military and law enforcement purposes. Several major drug companies have initiated research programs aimed at developing compounds that could temporarily induce the psychological and physiological traits that were naturally selected in violent sporting populations. The military applications of this research are obvious and deeply troubling. Defense establishments around the world have begun incorporating findings from violent sports research into training programs designed to create more effective soldiers. The techniques for psychological conditioning that were perfected in medieval football are being adapted for modern military use with the aid of pharmaceutical enhancement. The civilian applications are equally concerning. Corporate training programs have begun incorporating elements derived from violent sports psychology to create more aggressive business cultures. The same psychological techniques that were used to condition medieval football players to accept and inflict extreme violence are being adapted to increase competitiveness in commercial contexts. The educational implications of violent sports research have been largely suppressed, but leaked documents suggest that several government agencies have explored using these findings to modify school curricula in ways that would enhance population-level aggression and compliance. The systematic conditioning techniques that were perfected in sporting contexts are being considered for broader social engineering applications. The international diplomatic implications of violent sports research have created tensions between nations that have different attitudes toward the appropriate use of this knowledge. Countries with histories of violent sporting traditions often have genetic advantages that translate into military and economic benefits, creating inequalities that threaten international stability. The economic ramifications of acknowledging the genetic legacy of violent sports would be enormous. Insurance companies are already quietly using genetic markers associated with sporting violence history to adjust premiums and coverage. Employment screening increasingly incorporates genetic testing that can identify individuals whose ancestors participated in violent sports. The legal implications are equally complex. Court systems are beginning to grapple with questions about genetic predisposition to violence and how this should influence criminal justice proceedings. Defendants whose genetic profiles suggest ancestry involving violent sports are raising novel legal defenses based on evolutionary determinism. The religious communities have struggled to develop theological responses to the revelation that violent sports have left lasting genetic imprints on human populations. The discovery that systematic sporting violence influenced human evolution challenges traditional beliefs about divine creation and human moral agency. The ethical debates surrounding violent sports research have been largely conducted in classified settings, with most of the public remaining unaware of the discoveries that have been made. The implications of this research are so far-reaching that government and corporate interests have collaborated to prevent widespread public awareness of the findings. The suppression of violent sports research extends beyond simple classification to active disinformation campaigns designed to discredit researchers who attempt to publish their findings. Academic careers have been destroyed, research funding has been eliminated, and entire university departments have been shut down to prevent the spread of knowledge about sporting violence genetics. The international coordination required to maintain this suppression reveals the existence of global power structures that operate beyond the awareness of democratic institutions. The same networks that collaborated to eliminate violent sporting traditions are now working to control knowledge about their lasting genetic and psychological effects. The technological capabilities that have been developed to monitor and control populations with violent sports ancestry represent unprecedented advances in surveillance and social engineering. Facial recognition systems can now identify individuals with specific genetic markers, while behavioral monitoring algorithms can detect psychological traits associated with sporting violence heritage. The pharmaceutical interventions that have been developed to modify the psychological and physiological traits associated with violent sports ancestry are being tested in controlled populations without informed consent. These human experiments represent violations of medical ethics that would cause international scandals if they became public knowledge. The most classified aspect of violent sports research involves attempts to reverse engineer the conditioning techniques that were used in historical sporting violence and apply them to contemporary populations. Military and intelligence agencies have invested enormous resources in understanding how medieval football violence was able to create such profound and lasting psychological changes. The success of these reverse engineering efforts has led to the development of psychological conditioning programs that can produce the same effects as centuries of violent sports participation in a matter of months. These programs are being used to create specialized military units, intelligence operatives, and corporate executives who have been conditioned to accept and inflict violence with the same efficiency as medieval football players. The recruitment for these conditioning programs targets individuals whose genetic profiles suggest they will respond favorably to violent sports psychology. The selection process involves extensive genetic testing, psychological evaluation, and behavioral assessment that can identify optimal candidates for conditioning. The conditioning itself involves exposure to carefully calibrated levels of violence, pain, and psychological stress that gradually build tolerance and acceptance of extreme brutality. The techniques used in these programs represent refinements of methods that were developed over centuries of sporting violence, enhanced by modern understanding of neuroscience and psychology. The graduates of these conditioning programs are deployed in various contexts where the ability to inflict or withstand extreme violence provides strategic advantages. Many work in private military companies, intelligence agencies, or corporate security organizations, where their conditioning serves commercial or political interests. The psychological profiles of conditioning program graduates reveal personality changes that mirror those documented in historical accounts of medieval football players. These individuals develop reduced empathy, enhanced aggression, and altered moral reasoning that makes them highly effective in violent contexts, but poorly suited for normal social relationships. The social isolation experienced by conditioning program graduates creates communities of individuals who share psychological traits that were once common only among violent sports participants. These communities develop their own cultures, values, and social structures that are fundamentally incompatible with mainstream society. The long-term psychological effects of modern violent conditioning appear to be similar to those experienced by historical sporting violence participants. Graduates report persistent difficulties with emotional regulation, social bonding, and moral reasoning that affect every aspect of their lives. The medical treatment of conditioning program graduates requires specialized expertise that is closely guarded by the organizations that operate these programs. Traditional therapeutic approaches are often ineffective for treating the specific psychological changes produced by violent conditioning. The genetic research that has been conducted on conditioning program graduates suggests that the psychological changes produced by modern violent conditioning may be transmissible to future generations through epigenetic mechanisms. This means that contemporary violent conditioning programs may be creating genetic changes that will affect human populations for centuries. The international legal status of violent conditioning programs remains ambiguous, as most operate under classified national security authorities that exempt them from normal legal oversight. The techniques used in these programs would violate numerous international treaties if they were applied in conventional military contexts. The corporate applications of violent conditioning technology have created new forms of business competition that operate outside traditional legal and ethical frameworks. Companies that employ conditioning program graduates gain significant advantages in negotiations, market competition, and employee management. The political implications of widespread violent conditioning are staggering. Democratic institutions cannot function effectively when significant portions of the population have been psychologically conditioned to accept and inflict violence. The spread of conditioning technology threatens the foundations of civilized society. The detection of individuals who have undergone violent conditioning has become a priority for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Specialized assessment techniques have been developed that can identify conditioning program graduates based on subtle behavioral and psychological markers. The counter-conditioning programs that have been developed to reverse the effects of violent conditioning are experimental and often unsuccessful. The psychological changes produced by violent conditioning appear to be largely permanent, creating lifelong challenges for individuals who seek to return to normal social functioning. The ethical debates surrounding counter-conditioning often focus on questions of consent and identity. Many conditioning program graduates report that they don't want to be cured of their conditioning, arguing that it represents their authentic selves rather than an imposed alteration. The legal status of conditioning program graduates raises complex questions about responsibility and agency. Courts struggle to determine appropriate sentences for individuals whose violent behavior may be the result of deliberate psychological modification rather than personal choice. The social services that have been developed to support conditioning program graduates and their families represent a hidden welfare system that operates parallel to conventional social support networks. These services are funded through classified budgets and staffed by personnel who have security clearances. The research into hereditary transmission of violent conditioning effects has revealed disturbing patterns in the children and grandchildren of program graduates. These individuals often display psychological traits associated with violent conditioning despite having no direct exposure to conditioning programs. The educational challenges posed by children of conditioning program graduates require specialized approaches that can address their unique psychological profiles. Traditional educational methods are often ineffective for these children, who require modified curricula and teaching techniques. The marriage and family patterns among conditioning program graduates reveal distinctive social structures that reflect their altered psychological functioning. These individuals often form relationships exclusively with others who share their conditioning background, creating isolated communities with unusual social dynamics. The economic impact of violent conditioning programs extends beyond their direct costs to include the long-term social support required for graduates and their families. The total economic burden of these programs may exceed the costs of conventional military training by orders of magnitude. The international trafficking in violent conditioning technology has created black markets where criminals, terrorists, and rogue states can access techniques for creating psychologically modified individuals. The proliferation of this technology represents a threat to global security that is largely unrecognized by conventional intelligence agencies. The regulatory frameworks that govern violent conditioning research and applications operate entirely outside public awareness and democratic oversight. The decisions about who can be conditioned, for what purposes, and under what circumstances are made by classified committees that answer to no elected authority. The historical precedents for violent conditioning extend back to the earliest recorded civilizations, suggesting that the systematic psychological modification of humans for violence has been a recurring theme throughout history. Each civilization has developed its own approaches to creating psychologically modified individuals for military, political, and entertainment purposes. The comparative analysis of violent conditioning techniques across different cultures and historical periods reveals common elements that suggest universal principles governing the psychological modification of humans for violence. These principles appear to be based on fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The technological evolution of violent conditioning has accelerated dramatically with advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and behavioral psychology. Modern conditioning techniques can achieve in months what previously required years or generations of sporting violence to accomplish. The predictive models that have been developed to forecast the long-term effects of violent conditioning suggest that current programs may produce psychological changes that persist for centuries. The full implications of contemporary conditioning programs may not be apparent for several generations. The ecological impact of widespread violent conditioning on human society remains largely theoretical, but early models suggest that populations with high percentages of conditioned individuals may develop social structures that are fundamentally different from traditional human societies. The philosophical implications of violent conditioning challenge basic assumptions about human nature, free will, and moral responsibility. The ability to systematically modify human psychology raises questions about the authenticity of conditioned individuals' thoughts, emotions, and decisions. The theological responses to violent conditioning research have been varied and often contradictory. Some religious traditions view conditioning as a violation of divine creation, while others see it as a tool for achieving spiritual goals. The most conservative religious communities have rejected conditioning entirely, while more liberal traditions have attempted to develop ethical frameworks for its appropriate use. The artistic and cultural expressions that have emerged from conditioning program graduates reveal distinctive aesthetic preferences and creative styles that reflect their altered psychological functioning. These cultural productions often feature themes of violence, domination, and psychological extremism that disturb mainstream audiences. The linguistic changes that have been observed in conditioning program graduates include modified vocabulary, altered speech patterns, and distinctive communication styles that reflect their psychological conditioning. These linguistic markers can be used to identify conditioning program graduates, even when they attempt to conceal their background. The sexual and reproductive patterns among conditioning program graduates differ significantly from those of the general population. These differences appear to be related to their altered psychological functioning and may have implications for the genetic transmission of conditioning effects. The aging process in conditioning program graduates follows patterns that differ from normal human aging. Many graduates experience premature psychological decline, while others maintain their conditioning effects well into advanced age. The factors that determine these different aging patterns are not well understood. The medical complications associated with violent conditioning include both immediate effects from the conditioning process itself and long-term consequences that may not appear for decades. The full medical profile of conditioning effects is still being studied, and many graduates serve as unwitting subjects in longitudinal medical research. The insurance and actuarial implications of violent conditioning are enormous. Conditioning program graduates have different life expectancies, health risks, and behavioral patterns. that require completely new approaches to risk assessment and financial planning. The urban planning and architectural considerations for communities with high concentrations of conditioning program graduates require specialized knowledge about their social dynamics and psychological needs. Traditional community design principles are often inadequate for these populations. The transportation and logistics challenges associated with managing conditioning program graduates reflect their altered social behaviors and security requirements. Special protocols have been developed for moving these individuals safely and securely. The international cooperation required to monitor and control violent conditioning technology involves intelligence sharing and diplomatic coordination that operates outside normal international relations frameworks. These secret agreements represent a shadow system of global governance that most citizens are unaware of. The future development of violent conditioning technology is likely to include advances that make the process more efficient, more permanent, and more difficult to detect. Research programs are exploring genetic modification, nanotechnology, and artificial intelligence applications that could revolutionize conditioning capabilities. The countermeasures that are being developed to protect populations from unwanted violent conditioning include detection systems, protective technologies, and counter-conditioning treatments. However, the effectiveness of these countermeasures against advanced conditioning technology remains uncertain. The democratic implications of violent conditioning technology are profound and largely unaddressed by political theorists and policymakers. The existence of populations that have been psychologically modified for violence challenges fundamental assumptions about citizen participation in democratic governance. The educational reforms that would be required to address the implications of violent conditioning research would involve massive changes to curricula, teaching methods, and institutional structures. The scale of these reforms has prevented their implementation despite recognition of their necessity. The media coverage of violent conditioning research has been minimal and often misleading, reflecting the successful suppression efforts by government and corporate interests. The few journalists who have attempted to investigate conditioning programs have faced intimidation, legal challenges, and professional destruction. The academic research into violent conditioning has been fragmented and constrained by classification requirements and ethical restrictions. Most researchers work on small pieces of the larger puzzle without understanding the full scope of conditioning programs and their implications. The clinical applications of violent conditioning research have led to new treatments for certain psychological conditions, but these therapeutic applications are closely guarded and available only to selected populations. The potential benefits of conditioning research for treating trauma and other mental health conditions remain largely unexplored. The commercial applications of violent conditioning technology extend far beyond military and security contexts to include entertainment, sports, and business applications. The potential for profit from conditioning technology has attracted investment from major corporations and wealthy individuals. The regulatory capture that has occurred in agencies responsible for overseeing violent conditioning research has prevented effective oversight and allowed dangerous experiments to continue without adequate safety measures. The revolving door between conditioning research organizations and regulatory agencies has created conflicts of interest that compromise public safety. The international competition in violent conditioning technology has created an arms race where nations feel compelled to develop increasingly advanced conditioning capabilities to maintain strategic parity. This competition has accelerated research and development while reducing safety considerations. The proliferation risks associated with violent conditioning technology include the possibility that rogue actors could acquire conditioning capabilities and use them for criminal or terrorist purposes. The potential for conditioning technology to fall into the wrong hands represents a threat that is poorly understood and inadequately addressed. The detection and attribution challenges associated with violent conditioning attacks make it difficult to identify when conditioning technology has been used maliciously. The covert nature of psychological conditioning means that attacks might not be recognized for years or decades after they occur. The recovery and rehabilitation programs that would be needed to address widespread violent conditioning attacks do not currently exist, and would require massive resources to develop and implement. The lack of preparedness for conditioning attacks represents a significant vulnerability for civilian populations. The historical amnesia about violent sporting traditions has created conditions where similar programs can be developed and implemented without recognition of their connections to past practices. The deliberate suppression of knowledge about sporting violence has made societies vulnerable to the revival of these traditions in new forms. The cultural memory of violent sporting traditions persists in folklore, artistic traditions, and unconscious behavioral patterns even after the conscious knowledge has been suppressed. These cultural traces can be activated under certain conditions, potentially leading to the revival of violent sporting practices. The genetic legacy of violent sporting traditions creates predispositions that can be exploited by modern conditioning programs. Individuals whose ancestors participated in violent sports may be more susceptible to conditioning and more likely to experience severe psychological changes. The technological convergence of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and psychology is creating new possibilities for violent conditioning that exceed anything that was possible with historical sporting violence. These emerging technologies could create conditioning effects that are more permanent, more comprehensive, and more difficult to reverse than anything previously achieved. The surveillance capabilities that are being developed to monitor conditioning program graduates and their descendants represent unprecedented intrusions into privacy and human autonomy. The ability to track individuals based on their genetic and psychological profiles creates possibilities for discrimination and control that threaten fundamental human rights. The social control applications of violent conditioning research extend beyond the creation of conditioned individuals to include the development of techniques for managing and manipulating entire populations. The same principles that govern individual conditioning can be applied at larger scales to influence community behavior and social dynamics. The economic systems that have developed around violent conditioning technology create incentives for continued expansion and refinement of conditioning capabilities. The profitability of conditioning programs ensures continued investment in research and development, despite ethical concerns and safety risks. The legal frameworks that govern violent conditioning are inadequate to address the full range of implications and applications of conditioning technology. Existing laws were developed before conditioning capabilities existed and cannot address the novel legal questions that conditioning technology creates. The ethical frameworks that have been developed to evaluate violent conditioning research are similarly inadequate and often compromised by conflicts of interest. The committees that review conditioning research are typically composed of individuals who have financial or professional interests in the continuation of conditioning programs. The public awareness campaigns that would be needed to educate citizens about violent conditioning technology and its implications have been deliberately prevented by the same interests that benefit from conditioning programs. The lack of public awareness makes democratic oversight of conditioning research impossible. The historical pattern of violent sporting traditions suggests that the current suppression of conditioning knowledge is temporary, and that these practices will eventually be revived in more extreme forms. The cyclical nature of human violence means that each generation must rediscover and confront these traditions anew. The ultimate implications of violent conditioning technology for human civilization remain uncertain, but are likely to be profound and irreversible. The ability to systematically modify human psychology represents a turning point in human history that may determine whether future societies can maintain the values and institutions that have characterized civilized life. The choice that contemporary societies face regarding violent conditioning technology is not whether to develop and use these capabilities, but how to control and direct their development in ways that serve human flourishing rather than destruction. The window of opportunity for making this choice may be rapidly closing as conditioning technology becomes more advanced and more widely available. The lessons learned from the violent history of football and other sporting traditions provide crucial guidance for navigating the challenges posed by modern conditioning technology. Understanding how previous societies developed, used, and eventually abandoned violent sporting traditions offers insights into how contemporary societies might avoid repeating these historical mistakes. The responsibility for ensuring that violent conditioning technology is developed and used ethically rests with every individual who becomes aware of its existence and implications. The suppression of public knowledge about conditioning research means that a small number of informed citizens bear disproportionate responsibility for protecting human welfare and preventing the misuse of conditioning technology. The democratic imperative to bring violent conditioning research under public oversight and democratic control requires citizen action to expose and challenge the secrecy that surrounds conditioning programs. The health of democratic institutions depends on ensuring that decisions about conditioning technology are made through transparent processes that reflect public values rather than private interests. The historical record of football's transformation from systematic violence to regulated sport demonstrates that positive change is possible, even when violent traditions have become deeply entrenched in social structures. The successful elimination of sporting murder provides hope that contemporary conditioning programs can also be reformed or eliminated if societies choose to prioritize human welfare over other considerations. The future of human civilization may depend on how successfully contemporary societies can learn from the violent history of sporting traditions and apply those lessons to the management of modern conditioning technology. The stakes of this challenge could not be higher, as the decisions made today about conditioning research and applications will influence human development for generations to come. The disturbing truth about football's ancient rules ultimately serves as both a warning about humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty and evidence of our potential for constructive change. The game's evolution from ritualized murder to regulated sport demonstrates that even the most entrenched violent traditions can be transformed when communities develop the wisdom and courage to prioritize human welfare over entertainment. In our modern era of psychological conditioning technology, this historical lesson has never been more relevant or more urgent. If you found these revelations about football's hidden history and its connections to modern psychological warfare as disturbing as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the secrets that sporting authorities and government agencies don't want you to know. Leave a comment below about what topic you'd like me to investigate next. There are centuries of suppressed sporting history and classified research programs waiting to be uncovered, and your curiosity helps guide these investigations into the darkness that lies beneath our favorite games and the technologies that shape our minds.